I think we're gonna begin. Thank you to everybody who came out to join us this evening, and hopefully more people will be joining us as the event goes on. My name is Suzanne Daly, and I'm from the New York area. I am, among other things, the co-director of an organization called the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which is a binational alliance of worker organizations in the food economy. And that means organizations that are led by or represent or organize with a base of workers in the farm industry, in the dairy industry, in the food processing and meat processing industry, in the food warehousing and distribution industry, in food service and food retail. And we're a collective of over 30 organizations in the US and Canada that came together sort of with the goal of putting forth a collective voice for food workers who are some of the most exploited workers in the whole economy in North America, right? And one of our organizations is Justicia for Migrant Workers, which two of our speakers are from, and they're located in Toronto. And we also have another Canadian member called the Federation of Commerce. And I learned that our friends from Justicia were going to be in New York for some meetings at the United Nations. And so we wanted to take that opportunity to organize a forum, a discussion about their work, kind of using kind of this wonderful opportunity of Gabriel's like brilliant book. So what I'm gonna do is introduce each of the speakers in order that they're going to speak, and then I'm gonna ask some questions to help lead the speakers into discussion, and then hopefully we can also have a discussion as a group. So our first speaker will be Gabriel Allahdua. Is that how you say your last name? Excuse me? Allahdua, okay. Gabriel is originally from St. Lucia and worked as a migrant farm worker in the seasonal agricultural worker program for 4 years before leaving the program to seek permanent residency in Canada. Now he's a leading voice in the migrant justice movement and an organizer with Justicia for Migrant Workers. Most importantly, Gabriel is the author of Harvesting Freedom, and we're very happy to have him here today to talk about that book, which is really sort of an account of his experience as a migrant worker. We also have with us today Chris Ramsarup, who is an organizer with Justicia for Migrant Workers and part of the Asian Canadian Labor Alliance. He's an instructor in the Caribbean Studies program at the University of Toronto and co-director of the Migrant Worker Clinic at the University of Windsor Faculty of Law. Chris is working to complete his PhD at OISE University of Toronto and is also the coordinator for the Community Engaged Learning at New College, University of Toronto. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
And we're also very happy to have with us today Rob Robinson, who was a co-founder and member of the leadership committee of Take Back the Land movement, and is currently a special advisor at Partners for Dignity and Rights, formerly known as NESRI. After losing his job in 2001, he spent 2 years homeless on the streets of Miami and 10 months in a New York City shelter. He is a regular guest lecturer at the City University of New York Graduate Center and several university law schools throughout the US and Canada. He was appointed as an adjunct professor of urbanism at the New School in September 2021. And he is a long-time board member of the Laundry Workers Center, which is also a member of the Food Chain Workers Alliance. And on March 24th, he was named the 2023 winner of the University of Dayton's Oscar Romero Human Rights Award. Congratulations on that. Yeah. So Gabriel, I wanted to start the conversation by asking, why did you write this book? I think.
That's a really tough question. I would like to thank each and everyone for attending this important session. To me, it's very important. I think we're in the busiest part of this city. There are lots of competing events. Even me, there were so many distractions making my way here. And for you to end up here, I really want to thank you and congratulate you. Why did I write this book? For a number of reasons. There's so many reasons. I think it's 101 reasons. But the key things at the top of my mind would be, why did I write this book? It's because, and the pandemic spelled it out. In Canada, during the pandemic, Canada closed its borders and nobody was allowed in and out of Canada. But they realized, during crisis, we need people to produce our food. Who are the people they need to produce the food? Because food is not secure without those people. And who are those people? People of color. I wrote this book because people of color are being exploited in Canada. Why did I write this book? For a number of reasons. In Canada, on the world stage, Canada portrays itself to be a champion for human rights. On the world stage, Canada tells countries like China, improve your human rights records. Canada comes to the UN, and what does Canada say at the UN? All the rights and privileges that my citizens enjoy, I'll extend them to refugees. On the world stage, but quietly under the table, Canada perpetuates difficult living and working conditions. I wrote this book because quietly, Canada is very quiet about that. Canada has a culture of silence. Nobody speaks about it. America is generally portrayed as being loud and open about it, but Canada is very quiet about it. I wrote this book because so many people are really quiet about that. That's one. There are 5 Ds in Canada. Another reason why I wrote this book, there are 5 Ds in Canada. Canada is very good at denying those issues that people of color face. Very good at denying. Another D, they're very good at downplaying. It's worse in the US. They're very good at downplaying it. Canada, I wrote this book because Canada is very good at deflecting the conversation, derailing the conversation, or even delay the conversation. So I wrote this book. I wrote this book also. I came to Canada I came to New York because thank you so much. I came to New York because right now the world is discussing those 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable, and I'm really happy that there's at least a child among us, because what kind of world we want? We want when we leave the world, or when our children grow up, that the world is a better place. So discussing those 17 SDGs, that's one of the reasons why I came here. And look at the first one, huh? No poverty. No poverty. Yet still in Canada, migrant workers get below minimum wage. So what is that? They're ensuring no poverty for who? Again, because of exploitation, 1% or 10% get are exploited, and the labor of those at the bottom is used to subsidize their lifestyle. No poverty. And if you go through the rest, you would see that migrant workers find themselves very disadvantaged. So these are some of the reasons why I wrote that book. I want to tell you also, in Canada, thank you. In Canada, a migrant worker, 3 other names for migrant workers in Canada: excluded, denied, tied. Migrant workers are excluded. The laws that are designed to protect workers in Canada, migrant workers are excluded from that. In Canada, according to the Constitution of Canada, migrant workers are denied so many rights. Denied. And look at that, we excluded from so many protections. We are denied so many things, and yet still we are tied to our employer. To be tied to your employer and denied so much and being excluded from so much, what is that? That's a recipe for exploitation. These are just some of the reasons why I wrote that book. And I also want to tell you that in Canada, only our hands are needed in Canada to do the dirty work, difficult work, dangerous work, and so on. But in your hands, I wrote that book to let you know, to help you discover that in your hands that there's power. There's power in your hands as a human being, as a voter, as a consumer, as a citizen, and whatever skill you have, there's power in your hand. I wrote this book to help you discover that the power that you have and to use those power to create the fair world, the just world as possible. So these are just some of the reasons why, in a nutshell, why I wrote that book. I think I took a lot of time to answer that question.
No, that was a really important answer. I think the points that you're making about sort of Canada's silence and its complicity in the oppression of people of color is not necessarily something that we talk about in the United States as much as we talk about the oppression that's happening here and elsewhere. But I also wanted to ask you, I know that you're from St. Lucia, right? And what were you doing there before you came to Canada, and why did you choose to come in the first place?
Okay, a couple of things. I came to Canada. Had I come to Canada freely, willingly, I would be a visitor, I would be a tourist. I didn't come to Canada by choice. I didn't have a gun to my head. But however, I want to draw your attention to that documentary called Life, L-I-F-E, and Death, D-E-B-T. Once you watch that documentary, it spells out those institutions and those policies that create that wide divide. The World Bank and all of those institutions, they create that wide divide. So I was forced to come to Canada because of the wide divide has been created and maintained by those institutions. In St. Lucia, what did I do? Agriculture. I was born and raised in the countryside of my countries. Agriculture have always been my passion, and I've been always, that's why I came to Canada, because I was following my passion. But at the end of the day, some situations forced me to come to Canada. I was self-employed doing 5 different things, and it was a hurricane. When doing 5 different things, I felt my income was diversified. I used to knock my chest and say my income is diversified. And even though one is affected, I can still live a life. But just one hurricane really pulled the carpet. And that was in 2009. Preceding that, we had the global financial crisis. We had the WTO ruling. We had black Sikatoka infestation in bananas. And in the beekeeping that I used to do, we had an infestation of a disease that we had never had. So it was a series of events. And it was the hurricane really that, literally the hurricane was the last nail in the coffin that forced me to come to Canada. At that time, in 2009, 2010, the economy was still contracting. So it wasn't expanding with lots of opportunities to get work. And I was literally sinking, and I was looking at that point in time. I was literally sinking and looking for any legal opportunity to earn my livelihood. And the opportunity to come to Canada was the one that presented itself. But I want to tell you too, in my home country, St. Lucia, Canada have been good to me on so many occasions. My 2 friends right at the front there, we attended school together between 1986 and 1989. Those 3 years, Canada gave me the opportunity to complete a secondary school education. What would your life be? What would my life be without completing a high school or secondary school education? In my home country, Canada have been good to me. And during those 3 years, a lot of the materials that we studied, Canada stood out. There was a lot of comparison. When you study geography, you cannot study geography, don't study Canada. Like, you have to be at the Niagara Falls. When you study social studies, the most diverse ones, Canada really stood out. Canada was not just a country, Canada is a standard. Canada was a standard. So during those 3 years, Canada also helped me to study history, Caribbean history, the dark pages of my history. During that time, 1986 to 89, I thought I was just studying the history, something in the past, the dark pages of my history. But it's only when I got to Canada, I realized that the dark pages of my history, they're alive and well in Canada. And what I tell people, I have 3 legs. Unlike the average person that have 2 legs, I have 3 legs. My mother is of African descent, so I carry the slavery leg. My father is of Indian descent. I carry the indentured leg. And me, I'm coming to Canada to participate in another form of exploitative labor. So the mother, so the father, so the son. When will that stop? So these are some of the reasons why I also wrote that book. But these are the things that kind of forced me to come to Canada.
Okay, and one more question before I pass to Chris. What led you to start organizing with Justicia?
on a personal level, that those three legs that I carry, my mother, my father, and me, then my children, when will that continue? Personally, it has a personal meaning for me to break that cycle. And will you be a spectator and watch, or will you be an actor and act? So I became an activist because I want to break that cycle in my family, is one. Another reason is Canada has a culture of silence. And when I first met this group, Justice for Migrant Workers, they are the only ones, the first group of people, and up to now, they are the main people who are the voice for the voiceless in Canada. Why I became an activist? Because a lot of Canadians, as I said, the 5 days, they like to deny or downplay it. So I became an activist to let them know it. Why did I write that book? You heard straight from the horse's mouth. It's not a hearsay or he said. You heard straight from the horse's mouth. So why I become an activist? It's because so many people are denying things, downplaying it, and also they like to, I call it, they use a lot of myths, and it's so easy when people are not aware of the issues, it's so easy to buy into a myth, right? So to clarify all those things, these are some of the issues. The other thing too is the fact that Canada spends millions on the world stage to portray itself as a champion for human rights, and I became an activist to tell them, if you're a champion for human rights, well, here are the issues at home. Let us clean it up. So these are some of the issues why I became an activist. And at the end of the day, too, another important thing is the politicians keep on saying that is not an issue in my riding. That is not an issue in my riding. That is not an issue. So when will it become an issue? Is when the voters pressure the politicians. How can the voters pressure the politicians? Is when they become aware. And how can they become aware? Is when people are on the ground are mobilizing. And PPP. Our poverty in Canada is because of the unjust policies of the politicians. Identifying the problem is half of the solution. The problem is political. The solution is political. Who pushes the politicians? The voters. And I became an organizer to push the voters, to push the politicians to create those just laws and policies.
Thank you, Gabriel. Yes, please. So I'm going to turn to Chris now. And Chris, Gabriel began to sort of tell us about the migrant labor system in Canada, and particularly sort of a broad look at it and from his perspective. And so I was wondering if there was more that you wanted to tell us about that system, and especially kind of like knowing that we also have a similar migrant labor system here in the United States, both H-2A workers, but like on other sort of like migrant or undocumented workers who make up a lot of agricultural labor in this country, right? And then also a little bit more about Justicia and how it was formed and what its mission is, and what does your base look like? Yeah.
All right, so we'll do an exchange, kind of a conversation, because I'm going to forget this stuff.
Okay.
For both everybody on YouTube, okay. First, all the people watching on YouTube, my hair look okay? All right, got to check. And for the audience, just my jokes aren't funny, but I'm going to say them. And also, just to let you know, I'm going to talk about a few terms. And if you disagree with them, or if you have questions, just shout out, right? Ask me about these questions, because this is a conversation, right? All the peeps watching on YouTube, just send me a WhatsApp message. Most of you have my number anyways. I'm going to introduce some concepts that going to make you feel uncomfortable. I'm going to talk about Canada and thinking about apartheid. Two terms that we may not think about. What does apartheid look like when we think about Canada, particularly when we're thinking about these type of guest worker programs that Gabriel worked on? Gabriel mentioned this legacy of indentureship. Since everybody in the audience is pretty much of Caribbean ancestry, we know after the post-slavery period, what does indentured labor mean? And how does these programs today represent a perpetual system of indentured labor? Okay, so I want us to think about those two tough words and two tough kind of concepts when we think about the mythology of Canada. The mythology of Canada, as Gabriel started off with, is that we are somehow better than Americans, okay? We have something called multiculturalism. We're such a diverse country, and we all get along hunky-dory, right? In addition to hockey, maple syrup, and Tim Hortons, okay? So that's what everybody thinks about Canada. And part of our conversation, what we've been having for decades now, is trying to dismantle this myth. And for us to understand that more people come to Canada as guest workers without the ability to come as permanent residents, but has come as laborers, not as people. And when we start thinking about apartheid and why I use this word, apartheid means treating people through a legal system which is based on racism or racial discrimination. The program, when it was started in the 1960s, was after many years of advocacy, both from the countries in the Caribbean and the Canadian employers. They wanted people to come to Canada, but the Canadian state did not want them to come as equals. They didn't want them to come to live here in Canada. So both the personal documents of the bureaucrats, as well as the political comments in Parliament, talked about this need to ensure that, on one side, we must have free European labor. But on the other side, we must take steps to control Black labor first, and then Mexican workers afterwards, and now Hondurans, Thai workers who do not have the ability to exert their rights as a result of restrictive immigration practices. In addition to this, there's several other pillars of this program. The consistent threat of deportation or repatriation for standing up for your rights. The naming process, just like during slavery, where people would be named. If you're named, you'd be able to come to Canada, be able to work. If you're unnamed, you're not sure if you're going to be coming back to come back to work. And disbarment. If you fall in love, and I'm serious what I'm going to say here. If you go to the bathroom when you're not supposed to go to the bathroom, if you miss a curfew, if you stand up and say, hey, boss, don't start making racist comments. Don't use any type of racial language on me. There's a very strong chance that you will not be called back the following year. So these are the other additional pillars of this program that we're talking about as well, too. So coupled with restrictive labor laws, where farm workers don't have in Ontario the right to form unions. Workers' compensation system, which is supposed to treat all workers properly, but does not do so. And like in many other jurisdictions, agricultural workers don't have overtime or holiday pay. I believe in most of the Caribbean, whether it's Trinidad, Jamaica, St. Lucia, each of these countries, they do have these protections, but here in Canada, they do not. That tells us kind of this hypocrisy that exists. It all comes down to power of the industrial class, and that's the growers, right, who've developed this program in what they believe is in their best interest, not in the interest of the Canadian population or interest in the workers from the Caribbean or anywhere else in the global south. So that's an important way for us to start this conversation. But it's also thinking that when farm workers come up to Canada, it's just not that they're vulnerable or that they're weak or docile. People are trying to create different forms of changes. So it's trying to develop the different mechanisms and tools to do so. So we're learning from the periods of indentured labor, thinking about slavery, thinking about the different type of secret ways that people had to meet underground, or in this case, we'd have to meet in a Tim Hortons or in a Walmart, do things secretly at night to start trying to bring workers together. And in all of us as Caribbean peoples know the role of race and how race has been used to try to divide Indians and Africans. The same thing happens with these programs here in Canada, where Trinidadians, Jamaicans, Bajans, people from Barbados, I know some people from Barbados don't like that, Mexicans, Guatemalans, Thai people, Filipinos, are all divided in the workplace. So thinking about how do we develop multiracial forms of organizing. And this, I guess, gets back to the two last points I'm going to talk about is what we do. So I started off, and Allahdua here. Allahdua we used to work at the United Farm Workers here. Allahdua was here in New York. I was in Canada, in Toronto. And we had started in the UFW after a wildcat strike, which is when a group of Mexican workers withheld their labor. So we had started to organize and bring people together. And when we left, or some of us may have been fired from the UFW, when we did, we started our own group. We're like, look, this is not just a job for us, right? This is not just something we're going to go look at. This is something that needs change, right? So we, for the last 20 years, have been going to different farms, different communities, trying to expose these conditions, bring workers together, trying to embarrass Canada, not to just say that Canada is this land of milk and honey, but trying to talk about the fundamental problems of what exists, and to also engage in different forms of legal challenges. So two of the most important, the first important human rights case was a brother named Adrian Monrose, who was a worker also from St. Lucia, who was sent back home. He was employed at Double Diamond Farms. And they were calling those workers all type of racial names. And he was basically like, this is ridiculous, right? You cannot be engaged in type of racial language with me or any of my other brothers and comrades. So we took on the first human rights case involving a farm worker, and he won with our comrade, Shane Martinez. We've also been engaged in other litigation, and I'll get into that a little bit later. I don't want to talk too much. And all our work, we're all volunteer. All of us had day jobs. We all have different ways of doing things. Lastly, I got to call a few people, right? As I said, there's people watching on Zoom, not Zoom, YouTube, all right? There's a bunch of farm workers in St. Lucia, in Jamaica, in Trinidad, across Canada. Tracy, Dwayne, Alicia, Herbie, Kenny. There's a lot of members of Justice for Migrant Workers, Tanita, Jessica, Sang-Han, people here from the Fair World Project, for y'all, for the Food Chain Workers Alliance. This is an entire community of people trying to come together to fight for change. And our message for both people watching on YouTube and for us as Caribbean people, that this isn't an issue just happening way out there, right? The continuation of what we saw in the plantation system in the Caribbean is happening in our own backyard today. And there's no coincidence that our food system, both the United States and Canada, is not for feeding Americans and Canadians. It's about industrial imperial agriculture. It's about sending these crops overseas and disrupting and dismantling our own community's ability to feed ourselves. So it's important to think about the way that our food system works is not just simply about the food on our table, but about exploiting and indentured workers to come up from the global south to the north, and finally, having food from the global north through unequal trade agreements, destroy, dismantle, and basically disable our communities from the ability for our communities to feed ourselves. So I'm gonna just close off on there. And I'm expecting some messages from anybody. And no, I do not, Toronto Maple Leafs, I know a lot of people, Canadians like them, but we haven't won a game in like 50 years. So just wanna make sure you know that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so, when Chris was talking, a lot of what they're saying about the labor system in Canada also holds true for the labor system here, and particularly food workers, right? It's not that we are kind of intentionally saying that food workers should be in a different category than those who work in other circumstances, but there's something inherent to the food system, right? And how it's rooted in a history of slavery in this country, right? With the sort of a slave system and the plantation system, to the creation of our first labor laws that excluded farm workers from the right to organize, as well as domestic workers, because the majority of those workers were Black at the time, right? And then also historically displaced Black communities in this country from the land that they're from, that they used to farm as well. And so our organization then sort of approaching it from this question of how are we creating the conditions so that food workers can organize within their workplaces and in their communities, but then what do we also need to do to challenge the way that the food system is built in the first place? How does food sovereignty and building economic sovereignty and political sovereignty also sort of relate to this? Because unions are great, and particularly when they're bottom up, and we want to see more of them, but they're not. They can't be they can't cover all of it, right? And particularly when we think about the farms in Canada where a lot of your base works, we know that they're put in products that are sold here in this city, right? It's a supply chain. It's a global supply chain, right? But the supply chain also is the labor, as you're saying, right? So they create conditions so that the global South can then supply the labor for these very exploitative jobs. And I'm also thinking about similar kind of migrant labor schemes in the poultry factories, in the meat processing factories, in the swine factories, in the restaurants. And it's kind of this this kind of on one side, kind of criminalizing and harming people as they're trying to come into this country, but then at the very same time, exploiting them as much as they can in the economy, while also subjecting them to that kind of criminalization. And maybe perhaps we can talk a little bit more about what are kind of the conditions within the global South that our own governments participate in to help to drive that that labor supply. But I'm gonna turn to Rob. So Rob is on the board of one of our organizations in New York City, the Laundry Workers Center, but he's also part of many other groups, as I said in his bio, and including Take Back the Land. And I was hoping to hear more about that movement and just in general about the movement that you've been a part of, and perhaps the ways that you feel like that's connected to what we've begun to talk about.
Sure. So first off, thank you for inviting me, and thank you guys, my fellow panelists. It's interesting to hear the perspective from Canada, right? But I will start off by saying it's not much different here, right? And I'll be very honest and open about that. And I'm going to start out talking, Suzanne asked me to talk about the movements I've been involved in, particularly Take Back the Land, because for me personally, that was a pivotal moment. So you've all heard from my bio that I'm formerly homeless, right? And I came to this work from a lived experience. And when I came out of shelter in New York City, I spent 10 months in a New York City shelter. I would come out in discussions like this, banging tables and saying, we need affordable housing, we need affordable housing. But I also started to understand that in New York City, air rights are for sale. And what do I mean by that? As you guys come from other places, you look around at these tall buildings, well, New York City is zoned to go straight up. So air becomes a commodity. So land is already commodified. Now the air is commodified, and that's problematic. So that doesn't lead to healthy communities, right? It leads to communities who have the wherewithal to purchase land and purchase air rights to get what they want, casting us aside. And it was through this that I started to understand, and I started to say, okay, we need to decommodify land and housing. I'm not even sure if I knew what we were talking about, but if I knew what I was talking about, but what I did understand is what had happened during the foreclosure crisis here in America, and you mentioned earlier the economic crisis. So it was a point for me. I was working with a group called Picture the Homeless, and I was starting to learn organizing. And at that point, I was raised out on Long Island. I was raised in a working class family, and I believed in the American dream and all these ideals that they were feeding us in school. And even my parents believed in the American dream, and my dad worked his ass off to buy a house on Long Island, right? That unbeknownst to me, why I didn't see him as a kid is probably because he got a predatory loan, because my dad would sit at the dinner table stressed about the mortgage. It was always a topic of conversation at the dinner table. The mortgage, I got to pay the mortgage. So obviously he was dealing with a predatory loan. So fast forward to this financial crisis, and then we get the first African-American elected president of the United States, a pivotal moment for this country, right? At one time, a person of color was 3/5 of a man. You weren't even a human being. But now we've elected one, and he's quote unquote the leader of the free world. So it felt good the first 6 months. And I can tell you, I was working a radio show here in New York called Global Movements, Urban Struggles. And I was doing a live remote on the mall in Washington, D.C. on one of the coldest days in this country ever. And it was a kumbaya moment as I interviewed a white couple from North Carolina and a black couple from Tennessee who had 5 kids amongst them. The kids are freezing cold, and the 2 dads took off their coats and made like little beds. It was just this great moment, right? And then 6 months later, our president decided that he's going to take our tax money to bail out banks and send a message to us. Bank of America can't fail, but you can fail, but Bank of America can't fail. So I'm going to take your tax money and bail out the banks. And those banks started foreclosing and evicting us in record numbers like never before, because it was a way for them to profit and profit and profit. And it started saying there's economic injustice in this country. You mentioned poverty earlier. It's centuries old. We've never addressed poverty in this country. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King both took bullets to their grave addressing this issue of poverty. But for me, it was a pivotal moment, and I started to understand, okay, we have to decommodify housing. We have to decommodify land. And it was some folks in Brazil, a movement called the Movement of People Affected by Dams, who contacted an organization that is around the corner from here on 35th Street and 8th Avenue called Why Hunger, who was addressing food insecurity in this country. And they had a Brazilian organizer at Why Hunger who was the international or global organizer by the name of Saulo Arroyo. And they asked Saulo one day, nobody was using Zoom at the time, everybody was using Skype. They were on Skype one day and they go, Saulo, do you know this guy? We're going to show you this video. We keep seeing him say, you got to decommodify housing, you got to decommodify land. And Salo laughs. He goes, Rob? Everybody knows Rob. Hold on. And then he puts me on the Skype with them, and they were like amazed. And they invited me to Brazil. I started to do some contextual analysis with them, and I understood that Brazil's constitution said land has to serve a social purpose, a social function, has to be housing people or feeding people. A lot different than this country that values property rights over people's rights, right? So I was fascinated by this constitution. My analysis shifted then from affordable housing to we need to control the land. If you don't control the land, you'll never control the housing that's going to go on top of it, and you certainly won't control the air rights, right? So it was an education for me and a shift in the way that I think of our fundamental relationship to land. And Take Back the Land was an answer during the foreclosure crisis, because the most affected people by that foreclosure crisis was people of color. And particularly in Miami, where the group started, I was with Picture the Homeless. We had a chance to go down there and learn from this group, and you would find out that 3 out of every 6 homes on any given street are in foreclosure in Miami. And they started a movement down there where the Take Back the Land folks in Miami would travel around, find houses that were foreclosed by a bank or a government agency and the families were evicted. They'd break in them, move the families back in there, and defend their rights to be in there using international human rights law and language. And that's how a lot of the people got to know me, but it was that shift of understanding that our fundamental relationship to land needs to change. It can't be a commodity. It's not going to work for a lot of us. Why Hunger brought me into the food injustice and food insecurity movement, right? So I started working with groups worldwide like La Via Campesina, right? And you talked earlier about how U.S. money affects that. Well, in universities, I teach in a university, and they take our pension money and they invest in something called Tia Cref. And Tia Cref is investing in land grabbing in Brazil for agroecology. So all of a sudden, Rob's voice is important in those stages, right? And other people like myself. So you can see this arc that I personally went on in learning from these struggles that wasn't necessarily related to housing, but how I was able to weave the relationship to land being fundamental to all of our struggles. If you have access to land without restrictions, our lives would look a lot different, right? And so how do we change our relationships to land? I start out with what we call community land trust here. I serve on the board of a community land trust that was founded in New York City called, it's on the Lower East Side, but it's the one and only functioning community land trust here in New York City. So I think that's a fundamental way, but there's a lot more to this and we can go into it. I just want to speak on the human rights piece because I think that's important. I'm not a believer in the Constitution in this country that was written 250 years ago in good old boys language and written to support a select group of people, right? As I said earlier, at the time, people that looked like me were considered 3/5 of a human being, not even a man, right? So when you start out with that line, we the people, I question who were those people, because if I wasn't a human being at the time, I can't be included in that. And that's part of my lectures at law schools around the country now. As I go into law schools, I challenge the young folks who are thinking outside of the box to really drill down on that Constitution, because that's fundamentally where the problem is. 2 constitutions I follow real quick. The Brazilian Constitution, written in 1985, post-dictatorship, says land has to serve a social purpose. And believe it or not, the South African Constitution, post-apartheid South Africa, written in 1996, guarantees the human right to a home. You may not realize it, but if it's written in that Constitution, you got to fight, man. You got serious ammunition for a fight. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, you mentioned Why Hunger and Sado. They're actually allies of the Food Chain Workers Alliance.
That's my homeboy.
Yeah.
Salo and I, been in the trenches together from here to Brazil.
Yeah, we've learned a lot from them. And Yeah, I mean, I think you're sort of making me think about what I was kind of like saying before, as to like, we do need strong kind of like bottom up worker organizations, including unions, right? But sometimes like what the movements are organizing for and calling for is beyond what traditional unions are thinking about, right? And like, for example, we have in our membership an independent farm worker union in Washington State. That the first stage of their movement was to organize and then to win the union, but then it was to get their own land and grow their own food and build their own cooperative and like create a kind of a collective kind of like human sustainability, right? And I went to a tribunal held in Washington State recently where 40 farm workers testified, and and you would expect that they would come in and just focus on the health and safety and on the wages, but that's something that's already understood about farm labor. What they really focused on was the right to development, like the right for our futures, and obviously the climate crisis as well, and heat stress, which is like very dire situation, right? Like and continuing to be, but that leads to a question I was actually going to ask Gabriel, right? Which is. Well, first, anything that you want to respond to what Rob and Chris said, but I wanted to specifically ask you, what is the hope for the future for migrant farm workers in Canada? Like, or just, migrant workers in general, but like particularly kind of the community and base that you come from. What is beyond just kind of like confronting the things the way that you have been and winning the things the way that you have been? What is the hope for that community beyond that?
Thank you so much. This is powerful. I do not want to respond to them. Actually, I want to add to some of the things. I want to tell you that when you go to the supermarket, when you go to the restaurants, the food is presented in such a nice way that, again, we live in the city. Right now we're in the city. And the more disconnected we are from the land, the more the question is, are we concerned about how our food is being grown? Whether it's being grown by those who respect the soil, respect the environment, respect the workers, or whether they exploit it, you don't care about. That is one question. So what is your relationship to the land? He who controls the land controls your food. He who controls your food controls you. And that's an important question. I want to also add quickly, before I answer your question, whose story are we familiar with? Who's the one writing our story? In Canada, the average person, even before baby's born, they would know about Canada's role in the underground railroad system, even before baby is born. But the average adult does not even know about exploitation that's happening right there under our nose. Actually, the food that we eat in Canada is exploited. We don't know about it. But a baby, an unborn baby, will know Canada's role. And again, the whitewashing of the information, the misinformation. And that is why I'm really happy if you have a look at the books there, you'll see that there's a lot of stuff. But again, there's something called misinformation. But also somebody said, if you want to destroy a culture, you don't have to do much. Discourage people from reading. Just that. Discourage them from reading. This book I've read, I wish every migrant worker, every migrant farm worker would read that book. But the average migrant worker cannot read. And that is one of the pillars of capitalism. That is one of the pillars of capitalism. A very few at the expense of the majority. I want to add also, again, adding to your conversation, food, clothing, shelter, basic human rights. But what is food in Canada? Food is a commodity. Food is a commodity. I want you to understand the meaning of commodity. A while ago, he went to a supermarket and the labels on the fruits and the vegetables he saw from Canada. Food is a commodity. Which one is stronger, the Canadian currency or the US currency? So imagine food coming from Canada coming down there. You imagine, you know what that is wealth building. Food is a commodity. I want to tell you also that being a migrant farm worker, and again, that is spelled out in chapter 20 here, that being a migrant farm worker, we face 20 injustices. 20 injustices, and we can go on, but I stop at 20. And they're at every level of government. Is that an accident? Or is that by design? He said the very first line of the Constitution. What does it say? We. Who is we? And where's your 3/5 of... I want to say also, the particular program that this book is about, the particular farm program, a political party in Canada said, whereas most the average or the common the mainstream parties in Canada, they talk about minimum. Now you all know what the minimum wage. They talk about minimum wage. The only party I know in Canada that talks about a living wage, and let me deviate a little. Just during the week, they were saying the cost of living and the cost of housing have got so high that to be able to survive in Toronto, you must be making $27 an hour, and minimum wage is like $15, not even $16. So you can see the gap, right? But anyway, the only political party that's talking about a living wage in Canada, you know what they said? That particular farm program, it is so complicated. So complicated. And that's the system, right? Is that an accident or by design? It's so complicated, it's very difficult to understand it. It is so complicated that the average migrant worker, it's difficult for us to navigate it. And in Canada, and I don't know for the US, I don't think it's any different, it's impossible to get justice in Canada. Is that an accident? Or is that by design? I want to also add, in Canada, when the Europeans, and up to now, when the Europeans came to Canada, you know what they said? We cannot. A while ago, I told you that the free names for migrant workers in Canada are excluded, denied, and tied. But the Europeans, when they came to Canada, we cannot deny them freedom. We cannot tie them to a farm. We cannot deny them rights. What is the name for a European? Cannot. What is the name for a migrant worker? People of color? We can. We can deny them. We can exclude them, and so on. Even right now, with that war going in Ukraine, for the first time, Canada is saying any amount from Ukraine, come, any amount. But when it is Syria, global south, there's always a ceiling, 5,000, 10,000, there's a limit. But for you, Ukraine, Europe, any amount. Why? They are one of us. Now, what is that? Is that equality and fairness, or is that racism? I want to say also, the fight is really whitewash, against whitewash, misinformation, and so on. What is the hope what is the hope going forward for migrant workers? You touch it. Are we 3/5 of a man, or are we equal? When I look at the crowd here, we all have 10 fingers. We are all equal. But because of unjust laws, unjust policies, we are made unequal. Now, will you be a spectator and watch, or will you be a fighter and fight? Will you, when the Europeans came, what did they say? We cannot deny them. We cannot deny them rights. We cannot tie them to a farm. We cannot deny them freedom. We cannot. Are you going to fight for freedom? Are you going to fight for rights? And going forward, what we are asking for in Canada, there's only one medicine we're asking for Canada. The same thing that you did for Europeans, just do it for black people. It's not something new. We're not asking Canada to go to the moon and invent something. No. The same medication you give Europeans, the same medication that you tell the Ukrainians, people of color, the same thing. And what is that? In Canada, when we ask for status, I don't know what is the equivalent here, in a different name, but same thing, right? If I have status in Canada, I have an open work permit. I can work with anybody. But right now, being a migrant farm worker, you're tied to your employer. When you're tied to your employer and you're denied so much, you're excluded from so much, that's exploitation. But if I have an open work permit, my employer knows I have an open work permit. I can work with anybody who's willing to employ me. That means that the pressure is now on my employer to create the conditions to attract me and keep me. But you know what they said in Canada? If we pay those guys more money, the cost of food will go up. That is the excuse they give it. If they pay those guys more money, the real cost of food will go up. That's a nice argument, eh? But you know, in Canada, what is food? Is it a basic human right, or is food a commodity? Food is a commodity, and what's a commodity? Money making, profit making. If all the food that is being grown in Canada is allowed to go to the market, the real cost of food would be well within our means. But with capitalism, what do they say? You have to control it, scarcity. Oh, there's a shortage, there's a scarcity. And what is scarcity? In Canada, what do they have? They have a management supply system. They manage the supply in the market. When you manage the supply, who is that? In whose favor is that? The consumer or the producer? And are you going to be a spectator and watch? Or are you going to be a fighter and fight? Because at the end of the day, we all are human beings. And look at that. I'm going to fill up my lungs with air right now. all the air I can take. Are you worried? I've taken all that I can take. Are you worried? No, because there's an abundance. There's enough for everybody. And that is the reality of the world. There's enough. There's sufficient for everybody. But because of capitalism, they design it that a very few should have maximum and the majority should live on little. I'll leave it at that.
I'll
Thanks.
just share with you, air on 37th Street is going for $550 a square foot. All right, be careful. Be careful. $550 a square foot.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And thanks, Gabriel. I think, this is something, food is certainly a commodity in Canada and in the United States and in many places. And, it's kind of really like it's a race to the bottom, right? And it doesn't just create exploitative conditions for the workers, right? And not just in farm work. I mean, we've seen some really devastating conditions in other parts of the food chain too. But it also equals increased degradation of our lands and our environment and of our health and of our nutrition, right? So this kind of commodification impacts us all in many different ways. Chris, I want to get back to what you were saying about Justicia's understanding of this labor system as another kind of form of apartheid, right, or like legal racism, and how has that kind of been integrated into the organizing and campaign building and work that has been done in your movement? Yeah.
Thanks. So just want to check, how are you all doing? Okay, everybody's all right? Okay, everybody's here is good. All right, so for anybody who's watching on YouTube, as usual, like I said in our Facebook things, if you've got a question or comment, send me a message on WhatsApp. Area code 647-834-4932. So send me a WhatsApp message. My comrade in the back around the link tree, if you could put that up somehow when you after I'm talking, I'll come and give it to you. Okay. So in the room right now, when we use the concept of apartheid, how does that make you feel? Was it kind of uncomfortable? Does it kind of sound outrageous? No? Everybody sounds okay. So the reason why we use this terminology, because it provides a much more nuanced way, and indentured labor is another one, of trying to understand what's actually happening with migrant farm workers when they come to Canada. Another component here I want us to think about is the threat to democracy. When you've got large groups of people who cannot participate in any form of the electoral process or in civic engagement. So in a municipal community, when farm workers' bunkhouses are being built, they have no way of trying to ensure that their rights are being protected. At the provincial level, around labor laws, if you've got a population who cannot exert their rights to organize, to lobby, to engage, to build public pressure, we're going to continue this power imbalance that exists. And at the federal level, our immigration laws are being used to divide workers once again. As I talked about earlier, in a workplace, they use a piece rate system on one side, but they basically stereotype and racialize communities. If, for instance, a group of Mexican workers are working slower than Jamaican workers or St. Lucians, the entire group's going to be threatened by not coming back next year to the farm, and vice versa. Jamaicans, Lucians, Trinis, they do the same thing to each group, right? And that's how our immigration laws are being used. So I think that's critical. So for us to try to name history, right? The fact that it's no coincidence that the same people who suffered the Bracero program, colonialism, indentured labor, and slavery, the same bodies are doing the same or similar type of work in the global north, and how race has been used to say that these workers could come up just to make profit for the employers, but not to engage or to live as equals. So try to have those conversations, trying to link what's happening in the Caribbean and Mexico from what's happening here, and engaging with one of these terms, what some people call political economy, but cold, hard facts. According to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, in Ontario alone, the real estate for farms is $201 billion. And that's gone up, that was a 2022 figure. The 2020 figure was 141. So $60 billion increase in real estate value over the pandemic. Migrant worker wages are still minimum wage. And as I said beforehand, you can't, they don't get overtime, they don't get holiday pay, et cetera, right? So obviously somebody's making money, right? So part of what we're trying to do is to name this process, name power, find ways for workers to come together, using social media, using WhatsApp, right, to try to share messages, bringing workers who've engaged in different struggles, whether a wildcat strike, a protest, to talk to other workers, people who are no longer in the program, having them to talk their experiences. People on YouTube right now, many members of the Injured Workers Action for Justice, right? They're injured farm workers, both in the Caribbean and Canada. So for them to talk about their experiences with new workers as well as each other, to show, to affirm the way that systemic barriers are happening. So finding these different ways of telling a different story. And a different story basically counters the myth that all of you see every day, right? Number one, the myth of the family farm. When all of us go to the grocery store, you're going to see the names of these farms: Bill's family farm, John's family farm. But these are all multi-million-dollar, in some cases, multi-billion-dollar corporations. These aren't small farms. The idea of a family farm has power. It's an important story that's used to deny people rights. Okay, so when they go to the Supreme Court in Canada, or they go to the Labor Relations Board, they say that if you try to provide more rights for workers, you're going to destroy the family farm. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, that we've got a labor shortage, both in Canada and the United States. That is also a lie. All right, just last week, I had a bunch of workers from Jamaica who are asparagus workers. Asparagus, if you do not know, is a very short season. So these comrades were only here, these brothers were here for like less than 3 months. And instead of trying to find them more work, they sent them back home, okay? And if there's such a labor shortage in agriculture, why couldn't you find some other work for them to do? The fourth myth for all of us that we know about is that when farm workers are coming to Canada or the United States, they're doing so much better than going back home. That, of course, is not necessarily true as well. These same workers, they basically lost money, right, coming to work in the program this year. And we're seeing a lot of workers who are short-term or even some more long-term workers are doing that. So it's trying to challenge the myth of our food system, challenge the idea of who owns land, talking about the different ways that workers have been coming together, doing these marches, withholding their labors, finding other ways to resist, and trying to tell another story, the story that this book represents, and the countless workers who are watching right now, all the different ways that they've taken to talk about their particular story. And the last thing for all of us in this room.
Suzanne, can I respond to him?
Yep. Just for us, right? What are our histories, right? Whether in the Caribbean, how have we tried to resist the different forms of oppression that we've dealt with through the plantation system particularly?
So, Chris, thank you for that analysis. One group here in the U.S. that I follow, and I follow very closely, and I've interacted with a lot, is the CIW, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. That I draw a lot of power from those immigrant farm workers who created a movement that's pretty strong in this country. But I think there's a couple of things we need to name here, and it's come up in the conversation with Gabriel and Chris, is the economic system that we all live under, right? And here in the U.S., organizing is commodified. I'm going to go ahead and say it, right? There are people who go to school to organize people like me, but don't have the same lived experience as me. So how are you going to organize me? So that's problematic, right? And I think Chris had mentioned volunteers. I will never take $1 from a not-for-profit organization in New York City, and it's well known, and I say it publicly, and I challenge everybody, because when I do it the way I do it from the heart. I do it because I care, and I want to see real change. But I think we have to understand, and I think the problem that creates is there's not enough political and popular education in this country. So what is the role of workers in the capitalist system? So I'll tell you in this room, I'm an identified Marxist. I study a lot under David Harvey. If anybody knows anything about David Harvey, he's a Marxist theorist. And I have coffee every Friday morning with Professor Richard Wolff, a well-known progressive economist, right? We solve the problems of the world every Friday morning, and tomorrow morning at 8:30, Rick and I will get together and we'll figure out some of the problems. And he believes in a cooperative economy and society, but he's the one who really gave me a firm understanding of the role of workers in society and how we're being exploited. But in the United States, there's not enough political education on that, right? We don't understand our role and, what we're doing as far as production, and then understanding how the U.S. started exploiting labor overseas, right? It's not talked about enough. So, sometimes you feel like a lone wolf when you bring this stuff up, but I was blessed to be parked inside of academia, progressive academia, because there are organizers that will push back and say, oh, all they want to do is spew theory. But when somebody like David Harvey says, here's a book, read this and come back and let's talk about it, that's pretty cool, folks. And I've been blessed that way, right? The same thing with Richard Wolff, right? Like Rick and I could call Rick up, and then Rick's wife is a psychotherapist, man. What a powerful couple, right? I sit with those folks, and some of the conversations we have about shit going on in the world is just incredible. So I just wanted to say that in there. But I just, Chris, I appreciate your...
I appreciate when you're talking about commodified organizing.
Right. Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that we've been trying to put a lot of focus on in the past couple of years in our alliance is popular education. And so and it's not something that like people want to fund us to do, right? But like, and the last one that we had was on the question of what is racial capitalism and how do we, and we had Bill Fletcher and Drew Hill from the Mississippi Workers Center for Human Rights. I actually have like a thought, like a response to some of the things all of you've been saying, which I think can then become a good question, but I just wanted to see if anybody first in the audience had any questions first. Yes.
Okay, good evening, everybody. And I would say very informative, very good education, and hearing it from the inside of those who have experienced it, it's a revelation. And I would just like to ask Gabriel that you said that it's a system by design and it's systematic in how it's all planned. And we know back home in the islands that the program is something put out there by the government, and we are encouraged to go ahead and participate, right? Are they aware of what's going on in this program? As you said, it's all political, because this has been going on forever, because I've got uncles and friends over 80 years who have participated in this program. So what can be done on the home front? Okay, what can be done to, because we need to stop it from there. You are not going to get my workers to be exploited. I know it's something of economics. I know it's something of providing a job, but it has to stop. We cannot provide it with the workers. So I understand what you're saying. I do appreciate it. But how do we start to think we need to stop providing the labor?
Thank you. I like your question, and it's a question that keeps coming up. A couple of things I want to say. Let me start off with America. Between 1986 and 1989, during those 3 years I spent with you, I studied Caribbean history. And in 1823, this year is 200 years. James Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine. America said, what did America say? Any European power that wished to recolonize any island in the Caribbean will be considered unfriendly. That's the Monroe Doctrine, up to now. Let us go to the WTO ruling, the World Trade Organization. It is because of America that St. Lucia lose its preferential treatment in Europe. The same Monroe Doctrine they want to conquer. The question is, what can St. Lucia do? In Canada, the door is now open. When I say the door, migrant work, a farmer have the green card. I call it the green card. They have the full right to bring in workers from any country in the global, any. So if, for example, if your government, let's say the St. Lucia government say, I want you to treat my workers well, what would they say? Well, let's go to another country. Let us go to another country. So where's the problem? Is it dealing with St. Lucia and make sure the workers are treated well? Or is it dealing with, what is Canada? Canada is a world standard, a champion for human rights. Would you deal with in St. Lucia and then go to Mexico and then go to Thailand? Would you go around the world or deal with the real world champion that is at the root of it? You understand? But at the end of the day, we should tackle it from every angle, I'm sure, right? But however, the root of it is Canada. And there's so many things that can be said, right? And in Canada, in St. Lucia, what did they say? No news is good news. Nobody speaks about it because you see, at the end of the day, you know what the worker wants? The workers we are caught between a rock and a hard place. In St. Lucia, what is forcing us to leave St. Lucia, to migrate, to be a migrant worker? High unemployment. The banana is not doing well. Tourism not doing well. The hurricane. These are the things that forces us, right? And as I said, watch life and death. Life and death, it spells out, right? And these are the institutions that the developed countries create to create that wide divide. Watch it. So in our home countries, we face those difficult. We come to Canada or to the US for better, right? And even better in Canada because no news is good. It's coming to the champion for human rights, right? And quietly you face difficult, as I said, 20 injustices, right? I cannot go into all of them. So you find a difficult situation at home, you come to Canada for better, difficult conditions. So you find yourself in the middle, right? What are you going to do? Are you going to be quiet about it or are you going to fight? No news is good news. So you come to Canada, there's no news. But listen to that. No news in Canada. You don't hear about those issues because of unjust laws. This book there I've written, this group there, the program, that particular program that brought me to Canada started in 1966 in Jamaica. 1966. This group here, they started roughly in the year 2000, just over 20 years, right? So from 1966, nobody had been saying anything because it was a non-issue. It's because of people like this group here that really raising the issues, right? And I'm telling you, they said, listen to that, no news is good news, right? They said from 1966 to now, this year is 57 years. For the first time, somebody's publishing the experience. What does that mean? Is that freedom? Is that capitalism? Is that democracy? Or is it because of unjust laws and policies, right? So it's a real fight, brother. But as I said, if you want to destroy a culture, what do? Just discourage them from reading. And that is part of the challenge, right? Discourage them from reading. But I like, I'm just going to repeat what that point there. Tackling St. Lucia is one way of dealing it, yes, but it's not the solution, right? But multi-pronged, deal with it at a little of everything, but getting to the root of it is the main thing. That is our approach, right?
Chris, yeah.
Yeah.
Just to follow through with what
Yes.
I see your passion and your pride engagement. Have you ever considered working with other Caribbean members and as an activist group to pressure the Caribbean government? And like you work with Jamaican
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you.
and then
So part of our work is trying to bring people together, right, across from the Caribbean, both here in the global north, but also people back home. But it's also thinking about the Mexicans, the Thais, the Filipinos, and how do we build a larger multiracial group. Now, with say St. Lucia or Trinidad or Jamaica, the immediate demand is a couple fold. Number one, when all of us are talking about rights in Canada and trying to talk about the improvement and betterment of workers, they should not be telling the workers not to have nothing to do with us, that we're a threat to the program and we're a threat to workers. We're basically saying that workers shouldn't be screwed over. They should be paid properly. When a worker gets hurt, they have to have representation. These are basic, simple things that the governments should not be standing in our way. Number one. Number two, a comrade, you don't know the name, but we have another St. Lucian worker, and we haven't been public about his case yet. But last year, we won Ontario Labour Relations Board for Kenny Florent, a worker who worked at Double Diamond Farms, was sent home wrongfully, and the Labour Relations Board agreed with us. Now, this brother cannot come back to the program even though he was proved to have nothing done wrong. All right, and there's a disbarment system in St. Lucia preventing that, as there are in each island, right? We've got a bunch of Trinidadians that Gabriel and I talked to today. Jamaicans, I'm sure today for you, I had yesterday. All these workers have not been able to come back for multiple reasons, right? So that's another step, saying that people should have the ability to come back to Canada. And the last thing, that in the Caribbean, and when we do media back home in different countries, is putting pressure on the Canadians. Right? The Canadian consulates, the Canadian embassies can't just be trying to sell an image about Canada, about this like, land of equality when people are being hurt. So putting pressure on the Canadians and saying that, look, you're coming to our country to try to sell that our country is an investment. While our people is investing in your system and you're not providing what's necessary for them to survive, to succeed, and to benefit. And part of our work is looking at extended benefit. I want to be clear. I want to be straight up and clear to all of us in this room. Our demand is not to abolish this program, to take people's jobs away, right? Because these larger economic factors have to be addressed with. When workers are coming, they should have protections, rights, and benefits. such as a memorandum of understanding between the Caribbean countries and Canada say, treated as equals Canadians, which are not true. All we're saying is that has to happen. And part of the Caribbean program puzzle is to support the work that we're doing, not to be impeding what we're doing and putting pressure on the Canadians from their side. Is that okay for you and for you? You all right with that?
I just want to add a little line here. On the farm-wide work, and which is a common practice in Canada, on the farm-wide work, there were people from Guatemala, Jamaica, Barbados, St. Lucia. And I don't know, I can't even explain how that is done. When we go to work, we want the solutions want to outperform the Barbadians. At the end of the day, we want our supervisor employee to say the solutions work better than Barbadians. The Barbadians want to outdo the Jamaicans. The Jamaicans want to outdo the. I don't know how that is done, but that and exactly they pit one against the other, and there are lots of tools that they use, right? But at the end of the day, whether you Guatemalan, Jamaican, solution, injustice is injustice, and that is part of the work we're trying to do is to unite despite our language, our culture, but the injustice we are facing is the same. Why are we in the US now? Because it may have a different name, but injustice is injustice. Right? We may have different names for the devil, but it's the same devil, injustice we're fighting. And uniting, that is why it's called Food Chain Workers Alliance, right? Justice for migrant workers. It is trying to unite, but it takes time. And as I said, we are volunteers with limited resources and so on. And that is just, we're hoping this is just another tool to add to the layer of organizing. Yeah.
I just want to add, and I just quickly, because this is powerful what they're saying, but that is the basis of the work of the Laundry Workers Center. While the name is Laundry Workers Center, they organize low-wage workers. There is a photo store not far from here, very popular, called B&H, where we organize, and I'm a believer in direct action and civil disobedience. That's how you get social change in the U.S., right? So we shut down B&H for 4 successive Sundays in January 2015 and got social change from B&H because the business that you usually do with all the tourists going in and out, when 300 members are out in front protesting, you're not stepping foot in that store. We chase the business away. But I do think the Laundry Workers Center approach is the approach that they're talking about because they're organizing low-wage workers from the Global South, many different Latin American countries, right, who don't have a voice. And then I think the other thing is, we talked about popular and political education earlier. There is a narrative that you come to this country and everything is great. Well, I'm here to tell you it's different, right? I got transformed through a lived experience, but that transformation has me thinking a whole lot different than I used to think. And I don't buy the narratives that are being sold. And one of the biggest discussions I have, and I'll just say this real quick, is around home ownership is the way to wealth. And if you think about this, and people salivate to buy a home, but before you can buy a home, you have to have a credit rating. So I want you to go in debt before I'm going to lend you money to go deeper in debt to buy a house. It's fucking absurd, but we feed into it. I apologize. But you can see how enraged I get. Like, I can't buy that narrative, but so many of us do. So we're somewhat complicit in our own problems. You have to name it. You have to name stuff, right?
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. This is really a rich discussion. I do have like a closing question, but maybe we have room for one other question from the audience. If anybody else?
I think most of your questions have been answered. How do we fight this?
Organize. You have to organize your community. We have to have these types of conversations, but I always say the circle has to broaden, it has to get wider. When you talk about human rights in this country, we dismiss human rights for some of the same reasons that Gabriel named, right? And so I think we have to think about it different. So many people will say, I'm a human rights defender. I'm not defending anything. I'm enforcing the rights. I'm a human rights enforcer, if you ask me that question. I don't need to defend anything. Defending is imaginary, right? Yeah, it's something that's not there. I'm telling you, these rights exist, and I'm enforcing those rights. And it really came to fruition in 2014 when we brought the UN to Michigan to look at the water crisis there. That's when I was, along with a bunch of other people, were able to wake up Michigan and say, okay, you can't have water. You need water to survive. They're taking away your human rights. That's problematic, folks. And then all of a sudden, those voices started to rise up.
Yeah.
Buy Gabriel's book. Buy Gabriel's book, which is really important. This is our so-called link tree. I don't know nothing about no social media, but Tanita from our group is the one who set this up. Can you all see it or no?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so if you click on these, we've come up with some popular educational materials. Some art students developed different flyers. Basically, these are mock flyers of grocery stores, and it's for political education to talk about the wealth, the power, who controls what, right? So that basically, this is a play on what our industry is. All of you have seen flyers, so this is one example of us trying to talk about who owns what. Comprising different forms of workforces, who's going impoverished. We have one on racial profiling of migrant farm workers for a case that we recently won, involving where the police took DNA from a group of Trinidadian Jamaican workers during a police sweep. And we just won a big human rights case against that. And this is the first time in Canadian history we actually were able to get the DNA destroyed. So we have a flyer. So these are type of flyers we're using for educational materials. Healthcare, Canada, we love Canada, so because we provide healthcare. So many people who are undocumented, former farm workers, are basically having to pay tens of thousands of dollars for healthcare. They're getting more sick as a result of workplace injuries. And the onus, the download's onto us, people here. We're trying to basically figure out what we do to help people who are injured and sick. All right, so that's another thing that we've been doing, just so educational material, the consciousness raising that this comrade was talking about earlier. And just you could check more on our link tree. We have a petition, some of the legal cases we've taken on, what our organizing framework is, and just to try to continue this conversation, right? So thinking through what's up, how over here in this particular space, you all could continue to fight this fight.
Okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we only really have a few minutes left, but maybe each of you can just kind of give a 1 minute answer to the next question, right? I think it's just still on the theme of what we need to do, but particularly like also what is cross-border kind of like movement look like, and particularly, and it's already been brought in the room, like what do we need also in terms of the internationalism, right? Because either big pharma or big food, right, is global, right? And these systems of exploitation are global. And like we named apartheid, I think we kind of like it inferred to colonialism, right? The history of colonialism, and like and you were saying that like you're sort of somebody who looks at things through a Marxist framework, and I think many of us do, right? And in particular, for me, the theory of that, like a lot of the world's of the contemporary world's history has been a history of the global North stealing the wealth of the global South, right? And we look at that on a micro level in Canada and the U.S., but we look at it from like my family's from the Middle East, right? And my parents came as immigrants. For similar reasons, right? But it was a different commodity that they were after, right? It was oil. But like much of the Americas, right, there was a prehistory of their food system being exploited that has led then to the kind of labor systems that we see here. But then there's also so many similarities between Canada and the US, especially these myths of the labor shortage, and our Democrats trying to push through things that they frame as progressive, but it's just going to lead to more exploitation of farm workers and other workers. So last comment then, what is then what kind of cross-border cross-border organizing and international do we need in order to win these fights?
So I think the importance of international is front and center here. At least for me, it was a learning experience. I believe it's done better outside of the U.S., right? The landless workers movement in Brazil has its own school, a school at Florestan Fernandes, of which I've been to several times. And they go so far as to say, Rob, if you're in Sao Paulo, even if you only have a half an hour to spend at the school, stop by the school, right? And you're always going to learn something. So it's based on the theater of the oppressed. We are all oppressed people based on this society that we live in. But understanding, and Chris and I were touching on this a little bit, the commodification of organizing in this country. So I work with the Philippine Damayan, which is Philippine migrant workers here, and Linda Olacan's always asking me, Rob, how come nobody else works the way you do? You won't take a paycheck from anybody else. In the Philippines, we did this work after we worked our regular job because we had to. There's an urgency, and that's the one thing I've learned. The problems that we have here exist in Canada, exist in Brazil, exist in South Africa. There's a natural connection. And usually there are transnational actors oppressing us, right? So we need to do the popular and political education to understand who these actors are, and banks are at the forefront of that. Global banking, global capital is what's putting our lives at upheaval right now.
We need to have a further conversation about the organizing component. If some people might be lost with this idea about transnational and international solidarity, I'm going to break it down one time. There's something I forgot to talk about, what we can do. Every day, all of us are on WhatsApp. We're talking to our families back home. We're talking to our friends and our neighbors in our different villages, right? So the conversations you're hearing today, the media articles about what Gabriel and other workers are doing, sharing that information, talking to other members of the Caribbean community, whether these are Bajan workers, Bajan community members, Jamaicans, Trinis, saying that, you know, this is what we've heard here. We know this is happening to other Caribbeans, trying to have those type of interconnections as well too. That is one of the most important forms of transnationalism or internationalism, is these type of relationships that we already have. Talk to our communities, talk to our friends, talk to the people who we hate too. All right, let them know about this type of stuff. I think that's critically important. And through the Alliance, I think part of what we're doing, and Gabriel's story about what we saw these vegetables from Windsor, Essex, prominently displayed in I saw it in Yonkers today, but you come to Manhattan, you go to New Jersey, you're going to see all type of Canadian vegetables everywhere. And as you know, if you come to Canada, you see American vegetables. So through the Alliance, right, the supply chain, us trying to research it, to document it, to name it, and to build across this together, right, as workers and allies.
Yeah. Thank you for this powerful question. At the end of the day, what can we do at the international level? There are lots of things. As I said earlier, I came to the UN to talk about the SDGs, right? Here 3 of them. The first one is no poverty. Number 2, zero hunger. Let's talk about that. The same food that we can produce in our country, we come to Canada or the US to produce the very same food. And we are importing a lot of the things we can produce, we're importing it from those. So who controls our food? The developed countries. And controlling your food is power. Now, according to the theme for those SDGs, they say no one left behind. No one left behind. But we know that the rich countries, the developed countries, they exploit from the small countries. No one left behind. Would you be a spectator and watch, or would you be a fighter and hold them accountable? And we have to keep the noise at every level, and becoming aware of the issues. At the end of the day, I said there's power in your hands. But one of the best power is when you become a shallow understanding of the issues. A shallow understanding is not good enough. A deeper understanding, and you must excite. Once you have a deeper understanding, you must excite. And when you have a deeper understanding, I'm pretty sure you know which side you want. I'll leave it as that. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming in. Chris, Robin, and Gabriel, thank you so much for this powerful discussion. Bye-bye.
Back, forward, more. Life is well, let's move on. My whole life is well, more than